Hey homesteaders, welcome to another Sunday session of the Australian Homesteaders Podcast. This is where we have conversations about traditional skills, self-sufficiency, and just the experience of homesteading in Australia. We stream these lives into the group most Sundays, so you get exclusive early access to the full discussion and the opportunity to ask questions live before it's edited and uploaded as a video podcast on YouTube. We've got people in the comments saying that they can see us, they can hear us. Everyone's saying hello. So today's chat is everyday sourdough for families. How to integrate sourdough into your household rhythm with Nyssa from Our Small Footprint. So many of you may already be familiar with Nyssa from her YouTube channel, Our Small Footprint, where she shows how she economically shops for and feeds her family of 8 people. She's got her husband, and 6 kids, except there's a twist, right? They live off-grid on a remote property. So when Nyssa does trips into a major shopping location, she'll do a bulk shop that needs to last a family 6, maybe sometimes up to 8 weeks. And her videos are all about what she cooks, what she preserves, and how to make a frugal budget essentially stretch to fill the bellies of her family. And along with all the different ways they strive to be self-sufficient on their property with animals and gardens and all that sort of thing. So one thing that you'll often see Nyssa doing is baking with sourdough, with a sourdough starter, or baking sourdough starter-based products. She uses it regularly to make all sorts of foods, and it's part of the regular rhythm of her household, which is what we're going to get an insight into today. Welcome, Nyssa.
Thank you for having me.
It's lovely having you here. Does that just about cover everything?
Yes, I think so. Very well. Very succinctly, far more than I could have.
Now, I love your squirrels, so feel free to squirrel as needed. Okay, so I was thinking maybe we should just start with covering a couple of like lingo things, just for those people that are unfamiliar with the whole sourdough process, they can follow along with the discussion. So what are sort of some of the key terms that we are going to, we need to understand when talking about sourdough?
So you basically got the main thing is your starter, which is going to be your leavening agent, the thing that is going to make whatever you're making rise. So it's an alternative to dried yeast or live yeast. It is still a live active yeast, but it's grown in your own space. So it uses the wild yeasts from where you live to populate what you're using. So you need to have that fed and used to be able to then populate whatever you're baking. So your sourdough starter is what's going to create the lift in whatever it is that you're baking. I don't think that there's much else that is really necessary to know, to be honest. Like, there's all those different terms that people use, but I don't know that they're actually terms that are necessary for the average layman to just make sourdough. They're fun, and and there's lots of techniques you can learn, but I don't know that they're particularly necessary.
Okay, so some other terms we might mention is discard. Possibly. Yeah. I know some people have a no discard method, but I think you use your discard, so we might say the word discard. So
yeah,
what is
so
discard?
The discard is whatever. Discard is just sourdough starter, basically. So when you make your starter, you make whatever quantity you want to make. Some people make large quantities, some people make small quantities. If you make a large quantity and you're not baking enough to use that starter, then you have what they call discard, which is the starter that's left over after you've made your goods. So people then sometimes discard it, which is why it's called a discard. So they will just throw it away. So some people will just find that that's a waste product. Other people will use it to bake things that don't require leavening. So you can add it into like your banana breads and your pancakes and all that sort of thing.
All right, cool. So, and when we talk about sourdough, most people think of like a sourdough loaf, but basically you can use that sourdough leavening, that sourdough leavening agent for like a whole range of baked goods. So we're talking more than just the kind of sourdough loaf. So a common complaint or belief of people trying to like start or maintain a starter or bake with sourdough is that it's complicated and hard. Have you heard this said to you?
Yeah, there's a lot of people who struggle with the concepts around it, but I think that to a degree it's made more difficult than it needs to be. Like, obviously it's something that you have to learn, and it is something that you have to culture and you have to understand to a degree, but it doesn't have to be complicated as such. It can just be put into a daily routine like anything else.
Yeah, I think some people have even referred to their starters as, you know, like looking after a plant or a child, or it's something something very time intensive for them or attention focused for them. Hopefully this episode can demystify this whole process a bit, because this is really about everyday sourdough, right? And I've been in those groups where things get very technical and people geek out on sourdough, and that's awesome. But it doesn't have to be that way. So this is what we're tackling here. You recently did a video where you tracked starting a starter kind of from scratch. Maybe we can kick off and you can tell us about that process.
So starting a starter is probably where most people get hung up originally, because it does take up to 2 weeks to do it, and it does require a daily attention, daily feeding, much like children, which is why they say treat it like they're children. But there's lots of concepts around it about, like, you know, if you want to start a starter, you have to feed it 2 or 3 times a day, every 6 hours. You do it with this amount of weight and this amount of weight and all that sort of thing, and people can't get it to work. The concept of a starter is just flour and water. It is equal amounts flour and water, and it uses, as I said, the wild yeasts in your environment to populate that flour and water. When you make dough, your dough is basically just a giant starter, because all you're doing is you're adding flour and water and maybe a couple of other things and letting it bubble up like your starter does. A starter is 100% hydration. I suppose that's another term, is a hydration term. So your starter is equal parts flour and water. So it's 100% hydration. So if you poured it on a plate, it's just going to go into slop. So your breads are 60 to 80% hydration, which is why they get the structure, but they're still the same basic concept. They're still just flour and water that is being populated by this bacteria. The starter has the bacteria there all the time, or whatever you want to call it, the colonization there all the time, and you're introducing that to the rest of your ingredients to make your dough. So by having that colonization there all the time, you can make your dough all the time. So that's all you're doing, is you're just creating a colony in a jar that will then populate your dough. I think the time required, people get a bit caught up on it because it can fail, and it can, because there's lots of things that can cause it to, but I don't know, I've never had one not work. But so I'm not sure exactly what, like I add equal parts flour and water, and then I do that every day if I remember, for 7 days, and then start using it, because I may as well use it if I've gone to that much effort.
Okay, so I'd say if someone was to walk away from this interview today and go, all right, I'm going to try to start a starter, what do they need? Jar, flour, water? What's their first step, and what do they kind of need to do sequentially, and what signs are they looking for to know that, hey, this is working?
So yeah, jar, flour and water, preferably filtered water so it's not chlorinated, or a glass. If you've got chlorinated tap water, just leave the glass on the bench for 24 hours before using it, just because the chlorine can impact the colonization of that. The flour doesn't really matter. A lot of people say they get better results with whole wheat flours or rye flours and all that sort of thing. I just use a standard white flour from Costco and always have. Same weight of water or same measurement of water as it is of flour. As the geese going off in the background. So same measurement of flour and water so that they're equal parts mixed in a jar. Each day you want to give it more food. So people discard it when they're making a starter, and so that they're feeding less, because the whole point is that the small amount of colony in that jar is only going to be able to colonize a certain amount of starter in a certain amount of time. Okay. So the more you feed it, the longer it's going to take, because if you're putting a whole lot of flour and water in there and there's only this tiny bit of bacteria in there, then it's going to take longer to do it. So I don't know all the science behind it either. So my terms may not be correct. That's why this is very much, family, everyday sourdough. So the more you feed it, the more it's going to populate. It's going to keep on increasing because you're providing food. So each day you give it some more food because it's going to have finished eating all the food that you provided and it's going to need more. You can then discard some of it so that you have less in a jar, because if you feed it the same amount every day, at the end of the time, you're going to end up with this giant jar of liquid, and that's not going to help you any, especially when you're only first starting. So most people will just put equal amounts flour and water into your jar, and then each day they will get rid of most of it and put equal amounts flour and water in the jar. So you want the equal amounts of the starter, the flour, and the water. So if you're leaving a quarter of a cup of starter in there, then you use quarter cup of flour, quarter cup of water, and just keep on going. Each day it will theoretically bubble up and then fall back down. They sometimes have a stall at around about day 4. So sometimes by about day 4, you feed it and it does nothing and you think you failed, but you haven't, because it's just a plateau in its development. And so generally speaking, it's about 7 to 10 days before it's consistently rising. You want it to double to triple within 6 to 8 hours is the theory, but that's a really hard thing to put a set number on it, because it depends on what your temperature is. It depends on the flour you're using, what temperature the water was that you added to it, where it was sitting when it was doing what it was doing. So you really just want to watch the jar and judge it by that. And you just want it to double up and then you can start using it. So if it doubles up within sort of 12 hours, I suppose, then you know that it's got enough in there that it's doing what it's supposed to do.
Okay, cool. And it's a good point to say there's so many variabilities based on your specific location and situation. I know I have tried to follow, say, a YouTube video of someone going, these are all the exact precise measurements, dirt times, everything. And I tried to follow it and it still didn't work how it worked for them. And I think it was an important learning experience for me, knowing that sourdough isn't about this specific recipe. You need to understand the different things that are impacting it, the time of year, the warmth of your kitchen, where you are, all those sorts of things. So that's another important thing to remember. If you've tried it before, if you've tried to make a starter before, and for some reason the instructions you followed didn't work, it's probably not you.
No. There's definitely lots of things that can cause that, then more than just you doing something slightly wrong.
So once you have a starter, can you and you've got it to that consistency, and that consistency sounds like it's kind of key consistency, rising and falling, because that is going to be important for when you go to use it, scheduling out however you plan to use it. How flexible is using it? Can you put it in the fridge if you're not quite ready for it? Can you, I don't know, is there a way to make it
I don't use mine on a schedule. So yes, you can make it. Some people have warmers for their starter so that they know that when they feed the starter, they stick it in this little warmer at the exact temperature and they know it's going to be at peak at a certain time so they can bake with it. It wouldn't work for me ever. But I just feed mine when I remember and then put it in the fridge around about when it looks good. And then I use it straight from the fridge. So I have 2 large jars of it. A lot of people aren't going to want a lot of starter. A lot of people want to keep it as a fairly small amount. But I have 2 jars of about 400 grams each probably. And so I will pull them out of the fridge and I'll use it. And then I will feed it and I'll leave it on my bench until it's sort of doubled. And then I'll chuck it in the fridge. But I have been known to forget it, and so it'll fall, so it'll have done its double and then it'll fall, and I'll still put it in the fridge and I still just use it straight out of the fridge. It really is very forgiving in that, because it just means that the bread that you're making may not be on the schedule either, because your starter's hungry, so now it's got to feed in what you provide it, and that may take a bit longer than if it wasn't hungry when you used it.
Right. Okay, so yeah, there's actually a lot more flexibility there than sometimes you can be led to believe by researching sourdough on the internet.
Everyone says that you have to use it at peak, and I use mine straight from the fridge.
Okay, so you talked about leavening before, and we spoke about discard, and you said you use the discard for items that you don't need the leavening for. Why does that discard not have enough leavening? It just doesn't have enough leavening in it, or
it does if you're willing to wait, basically.
Okay.
So that discard, that not when you're first making your starter, because if you discard when you're first making your starter, that discard's going to be not very healthy, not very well populated, because you're still creating that population.
Yep.
But afterwards, once your starter is, I don't have discard as such.
Yep.
Sometimes, if I leave my starter on the bench and it's been a couple of days and I've forgotten about it, so it's been sitting there flat for a while, then I would classify that as discard, only because it'll be really, really strong tasting.
Okay.
So it'll be really sour. It'll smell slightly like nail polish cleaner, a little bit like that. It has that real vinegary type smell to it. So I will use that in something that I would classify as discard, that isn't going to then ferment for too long. Because if you use that really smelly starter in a bread, and then you've let that bread rise overnight, and then you've stuck it in the fridge before you bake it, the sour factor of that bread is going to be massive. It's going to be really huge.
Strong.
But if I use it in something like crackers, where the crackers get made, refrigerated for half an hour, and then rolled out, then it's not going to ferment to that point either. So that sour, it's still going to be slightly sour because it's sourdough, but it's not going to have that really astringent flavor to it. Okay.
So someone in the comments asks if you do the float test before you use it. No.
Yeah.
No, I haven't seen you do the float test on your videos. But
I've heard of it. I think you can see the texture of it if it's going to float, though. On the video that I did about the starter, I mentioned the texture of the starter. You can tell by the texture of the starter how healthy it is, and the healthier a starter is, it looks like dough. It comes out really viscous and really it blops out, and you can look at that and you can sit there and you go, that would float. You can just see that would be the kind of texture that would float. Whereas if the starter's gone flat or whatever, when you pour it, it just sinks. It just puddles, because it has no texture to it. It has no viscosity or anything like that to it.
All right, cool. All right, so you can start a starter with a jar, flour, water. Is there other ways to start a starter? Could you use discard to start another starter, or can you get I think I've heard you can get dehydrated starters, or
discard is a starter, basically. Okay. So if you feed discard, you've got a starter, because it's just part of the starter. It's just a really hungry part of the starter. And I don't really understand, the whole discard term is a bit odd, because it's still starter. All it is it's hungry. So if you fed your discard, instead of throwing it away, you would just have another jar of starter. It would just be more starter. You can dehydrate your starter, and then you can have dried flakes, and then you can rehydrate it. You still have to feed it for a couple of days, from what I understand. So it still has to be given time to repopulate, I suppose. And I think some people have frozen some, but I don't know how well that would work. But you can buy it in a lot of places, just online. They just send you a chunk of stiff starter, generally. So a lower hydration starter, something that's got, instead of being 100%, instead of being 50-50, it's more like a dough. So you receive it as more like a chunk, because that's going to travel better in the post than a liquid would.
Cool. Oh yeah, so I was going to ask about the freezing, because I think I've read that, and that's really interesting. So if you've got a friend that makes great sourdough, just ask them for some. Just ask them for a blob in a jar, and you're good to go.
Yep.
If you want to start with something that is already established, it might be easier. Okay, so all right. So what I really want to know about is I really want to like find out about that kind of rhythm that you get into of using your starter to bake with. Could you like walk us through what it might look like over the course of, say, a week in your kitchen, like including just, not like the perfect scenario, just, real life using sourdough.
Yeah. So for me, because I carry a fair whack of sourdough starter at a time, I tend to bulk make a few things at once. So if both my jars are full, then I will make a couple of loaves of something for the next day. So I'll mix up something. I do a lot of overnight proofs because it's just simpler. So for me, for the way our rhythm runs, so of an afternoon, I might mix up like 2 loaves of bread, either a boulet or a batard or a focaccia or something, just 2 loaves of bread. And then I might also mix up like pizza dough. So I'll use all the starter in my jars and make it all up at once. The pizza dough and the bread are both going to proof overnight, but the next morning the pizza dough will go in the fridge and can be used that night or the night after, up to sort of 3 days post that. And then the bread will be baked the next day. So then I've used all the starter and I feed it again so that I can let it grow and see what needs doing. Now, I would then probably put that in the fridge the next morning because I've already got all this bread that I've just made for the next few days. But then it's in the fridge to use for whenever I decide to make it. So I made crackers. I made rosemary thyme crackers the other day. So, and if I had extra starter, I'd just make a bunch of them up throughout the week. I make a batch of them and they get eaten in one sitting, so I don't make them that often. it's fairly time intensive for a very quick eaten snack. But I make a lot of pasta too. So if I've just fed it and I've got it sitting there and I don't need to make bread, I can make pasta, and I generally make that in bulk as well because we have surplus eggs. So for me, the pasta uses 100 grams of starter per 500 grams of pasta sort of thing. So I might make 4 lots of pasta up, and then I've got that pasta for the next however long as well. The fact that it lives in the fridge makes it easy. So as soon as you feed it and you let it grow, you stick it in the fridge, it means that at any point you can pull it out. I do most of my stuff overnight. So I do most of the stuff is mixed up after dinner and then is put on the bench for overnight. It depends on the weather. You have to be, if it's too hot, it can't do an overnight proof. And if it's too cold, then it needs to come inside where the fire is. But in the middle parts, it's nice. When it's middling weather, it's nice to be able to do it. So I normally make things up of an evening and then let it proof overnight and then either bake it or shape it and fridge it the next day. That is the general way that I do it. And by doing that, I'm making it of an afternoon and feeding the starter. So it means that the starter is pretty much at peak by the next morning. So it means that I'm putting it in the fridge when it's at peak, which is the optimal thing to do, but not necessary, but the optimal thing to do. The way we just make whatever we feel like making at the time too. Like if I make bagels, then again, it's made at night, it's shaped and cooked in the morning, but I tend to make a quadruple batch. So we end up with 40 odd bagels so that it's a couple of days worth of food, because it takes a couple of hours in the morning to boil them all and bake them all. English muffins are a bit the same way. So I tend to only use it every couple of days and it sits in the fridge for those couple of days. And so it'll get fed of an evening when I make dough, go in the fridge in the morning, and then say 2 evenings later, I'll pull it out and use it in the same way again for something slightly different, but the same process. So it just gets, the fridge holds it for me when I need it to be held, and I tend to bake in bulk. The ability to have it double in 6 to 8 hours is handy if you want to do it in the morning. You can feed it in the morning and then have it ready to make something of an evening as well. But generally speaking, everything we make is an overnight thing. So everything's done of an evening, and then the starters put in the fridge in the morning, and then that process goes again in a couple of days. It also means having it in the fridge that you can do something simple like pancakes or anything with it if you want to. Like I did apple fritters yesterday. the starter had been in the fridge, so I just pulled it out and I just mixed diced apple with the starter to make apple fritters. So having the large quantity works for me. If I make granola, it takes 500 grams of starter to make granola and that sort of thing. So by having it in the fridge all the time at decent quantities, it means that you don't have to plan it. I think that's the big thing. It's not planned. It's fed in large quantities, stuck in the fridge, and then whenever I want to use it, it's there to be used. I don't have to plan baking my sourdough. I don't have to plan using it. I don't have to time it or anything else. So by just having that fridge stash of it, it allows me to use it however I want to use it on a whim. I think that's where sourdough does struggle. People sit there and think, well, I can't do sourdough because I've got to do it at this time and then this time, and then I've got to be there to do this and I've got to be there to do that. But having the ability to keep a fairly large quantity in the fridge means that you can use it whenever you want. You can just have a desire to use it and go and do it.
Yeah, perfect. And that's kind of that's the ultimate way of doing it for a homestead, when you've got so many other things going on. You've got different produce coming out of the garden. You might not be, baking these exact number of artesian loaves on certain days during the week. It's everyday family use.
Yeah.
You've mentioned quite a number of things that you use it for. Can you throw a few more out at me just for people listening? Someone commented, pasta, that's really interesting. There might be some things that people don't understand, that you can use sourdough or the maybe we shouldn't call it discard, maybe we should do it, starter excess or something like that. So what are the what's the variation of recipes that you've done either regularly or tried and have found to be successful?
I did a sourdough pie crust for a while there. I don't make it much anymore because I use lard for my pie crust now, but a sourdough pie crust was quite nice. The pasta is amazing. Sourdough pasta is amazing. You mix it all up and you let it sit at room temperature, and then you refrigerate it, and then you roll it out. And when you cook it, the texture of it is really silky. It's a wonderful way to use it. We do crackers, as I said, when I can be bothered making crackers that will go in one meal. The kids really like granola, so we do granola with our yogurt, and they like the granola in clusters, not in pieces. Like, they don't like muesli, they like granola clusters. So I use the starter basically as the binding agent. So a lot of people use like honey and stuff, like they use a sweetener as the binding agent to make the clusters. So I use the sourdough to do that. We make bagels, we make English muffins, cinnamon scrolls and things like that. I did Easter. I can't remember the origin of it now. It was a European country. It was a Easter bread that had almonds and brown sugar and stuff in a braid, like an Easter braided, can't remember the name of it now, but an Easter braided dough. And we do hamburger buns regularly with it as well. You can use it in anything. Like, you can use it. It is just flour and water. So if you have an excess of starter that you want to use and you just don't want to waste it, anything you make that has flour and water in it, just use the same. So if you're making a banana bread and you've got 100 grams of starter, then remove 50 grams of water and 50 grams of flour, add the 100 grams of starter instead, and you've got the same equivalent, because your starter is 50% water, 50% flour. So if you take that same quantity away of flour and water from any recipe you make, then you can just add it in there. It's not going to affect anything if you're not letting it ferment. Like if you made your banana bread with that starter in it and baked it straight away, it gives it a bit of a tenderer crumb because it's higher hydration, but it doesn't ferment in your banana bread because you're not allowing it time to ferment. You're baking it straight away, which stops all fermentation. So at any point, at any time, you can use your starter in any recipe just by swapping out some of your liquid and flour to the same quantity of starter that you're putting in it.
That is great. There's a lot of chatter about the pasta. Do you have a specific video on your channel that maybe shows more in depth, like what you do? If we might have to go for a search, and we'll pop that in the comments. Could you maybe just talk through your typical pasta recipe that you do with sourdough?
Yeah, I think there's a whole video on it, but it's all I do is 400 grams of plain flour with 3 eggs, 100 grams of starter, and 60 grams of oil into a food processor. I use my Thermomix because I have a Thermomix, and then just bring it to the ball stage like you do any pasta. Sourdough pasta has to be a little drier than standard pasta. So when it's mixed together, it might look like it's a little more crumbly than a standard pasta, because as it ferments, it hydrates that flour. So you're going to sit it on your bench for 3 or 4 hours. It'll hydrate and it'll be really silky smooth after that 3 or 4 hours. And then I stick it in the fridge. And when I get around to it, I roll it out and hang it. So I store all my pasta in the freezer. I don't dry it and keep it dried. I'm not comfortable with that it's too humid and everything else here. It's got egg in it. So I roll it all out with my KitchenAid pasta roller thingy.
Yep.
And I hand cut it with a pastry roller because I don't have a pasta cutter, and hang it on a stand. And then I let it dry just enough that it's handleable. And then I stick it in Ziploc bags in the freezer to keep it. And it's cooked just like anything else. It only takes around about 6 to 8 minutes in a pot of boiling water when it's fresh, a couple of minutes more if it comes from the freezer.
All right, great. We've actually got we got Deborah in the comments, who is obviously a big Our Small Footprint fan, who is dropping all the videos that you've got in reference to whatever we're just. Thank you so much, Deborah. Really appreciate that. It saves us having to go back afterwards and put them in. Oh yeah, everyone's yes. Okay, we've got a lot of people in the comments that watch you regularly, so they are filling everybody in which videos to watch for when. Okay, so there is another recipe that I love watching you make this every time. It's the focaccia. Yeah. It just looks so like luscious. Can you tell me about your focaccia? Like
it's almost pastry like. It reminds me of like a croissant, the way it layers, the texture of the focaccia. We really enjoy it. So the focaccia takes a little more hands-on. So there's some recipes that are a lot of no need recipes, and that's great. They turn out fine. But by putting a little bit more hands-on time, you can get different results. So by working the dough, it's going to change the end result. So for a focaccia, there's heaps of focaccia recipes out there where you just pour the dough in a tray and you let it bubble up and you cook it, and they work. They're perfectly fine. But this one's a little bit more hands-on to get those layers in the focaccia. So it's one that started earlier in the day, so sort of like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but I tend to be in the kitchen at that time of the day anyway, because I start planning dinner and all the rest of that sort of stuff. So we mix it up. It's a slightly enriched, it's got a tiny bit of oil and a tiny bit of honey in it, but it's otherwise just a standard dough. And once it's mixed up, I put it in bowls, and I will do what's called coil folds. So it's where you're basically picking it up and letting it fold itself underneath. So you pick it up from the middle and it folds. There is a video that shows me doing it, but if you Google coil folds, they're everywhere. And by doing that, you're creating a bit like a croissant. You're creating those circular layers where it's folding in on itself. So we do that every half an hour for a while. It really doesn't matter. Like the more you do it, the theoretical better structure your dough is going to have, but at the same time, doing it a couple of times is going to be better than doing it none as well. And then that one goes in the fridge for a few hours once you've done that. And then at 10 o'clock at night, I tend to put it out in the trays for proving overnight, and then I bake it off in the morning. Nice. So there's nothing fancy about the ingredients or anything else. It's just one that has a little bit more hands-on to create the structure of the dough before it cooks. And again, you can make lots of focaccias without doing any of that. It just comes down to time and the ability to do it. We have been doing it a lot lately because we do appreciate that little bit of extra fluffiness that comes from it. But yeah, it's just one of those. We like it because it's nice and versatile, because you can slice it in half and use it as sandwiches, or you can use it to dip into soups, or you can use it we quite often just eat it as is. I make a tomato confit to have with it, which is really nice. But yeah, it's one of the few that I do a little bit more hands-on with because of the benefits at the end of it.
Yeah, no, it looks beautiful, that focaccia one. And I remember seeing like that it was a special folding technique. And it's definitely been on your channel like quite a bit lately. So it must be a family favorite.
Well, it's a nice one too because it has a thinner crust. So, your standard ball doughs, your boulets and your batards and stuff, they tend to have a really dense crust. So they're quite hard to chew, which is lovely. I like a good crust on a bread, but the focaccias tend to be a really thin, crunchy crust, which then is a bit easier to eat and a bit better for a sandwich, in my opinion, because if you're putting two pieces of bread with a heavy crust, then that's hard to get through. We tend to use that more for toast to open things rather than like a sandwich style.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so what sort of equipment, if someone wanted to, we've dealt with like a jar, water, flour, what other equipment would it be handy to have in your kitchen for making sort of a variety of things out of sourdough? I know you can buy specialist stuff. How much of that is necessary? What's your equipment look like?
Spatulas.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
And your hands. Like I do a lot with my hands rather than anything else. You can get a Danish dough whisk, which is a fancy looking whisk, which is really good for bringing dough together. But a spatula works just as well, or your hands. A cover for your bowls. You need to cover the bowls while the dough is proving so it doesn't get a skin on it. There is some really nice beeswax ones, or I like the 3 packs of shower caps from Kmart. They work quite well. The disposable shower caps you can buy on eBay, like there's 100 packs of them, really cheap, are good, but they're basically only one use because they tend to tear because they're disposable shower caps. I have actually been using compostable cling wrap lately. I got some on special and I've been giving that a go. But you do need something that's going to stay over it. So if the cling wrap's not going to stick to your bowl, then if it falls off, you've got an issue. You need to keep your bowl. Some people use tea towels, wet tea towels, that sort of thing too, but you just need something to cover your dough. You can use a lidded container, but if you forget about your dough and leave it for a little bit and there's too much gas built up, the lid will pop off. Like I have Tupperware containers that a viewer gifted me some Tupperware containers, and I have been standing in the kitchen and been startled because the lid has gone pop of a bowl because the gas is built up in the bowl. But I use so a lot of people use Dutch ovens to cook their loaves. I use blue camping billy cans, the little blue enamel billy cans. Yeah, that's what I use for baking because I can fit 2 of them in the wood stove. You need to, if you're making loaves and you want to fridge them, like you want them to go in the fridge for 24 hours, which is a good part of your process, you have to put them in something that will breathe. They can't go in a bowl because if the dough can't breathe, it can't create a skin. So most people have things like the bannetons, the woven cane, I don't know what they're made out of, the baskets that have the weave on them. I don't use those because they go moldy. We have an outdoor kitchen and humid weather and they go moldy. So I have stainless steel colanders that I got from Kmart, little 20 centimeter stainless steel colanders, and I just line them with a tea towel. So I don't use anything particularly fancy. I have a razor that I pulled out of Daryl's toolbox for scoring my dough. Yeah. Nice. And a good bread knife is handy for cutting it up, especially if you're making things that have a crisp crust. Scales, jar, flour and water, and a spatula is really, you can make do with just about everything else, with a couple of tea towels and a bit of cling wrap and things like that. It does depend on what you're aiming to do though. Like if you're aiming to have fancy artisan loaves that are done in a Dutch oven with a big nice ear and things like that, then people use ice and they use slings in the Dutch ovens and things like that. But I can't keep track of that kind of stuff. It would go missing and it would make things more difficult than they need to be for me.
So, and your focaccia is done in like a rectangle kind of baking tray. And your pizza, because you cook in a barbecue, your oven is a barbecue, that's the same as us.
I have a pizza box.
Okay.
I have one of the, so it's from Bunnings, $80. I can't remember the name of the brand. There is actually a review of it on my YouTube. But it's a box that you sit on top of your barbecue, and the gas comes up through the bottom, and it's got a pizza stone in it. So you then slide the pizza straight in there. Definitely recommend that sort of thing for pizza. It works. We used to just do it on an upside down baking a cookie tray, and it works fine. But the pizza oven definitely gives you a boost, especially with sourdough, because it gives that initial pop of heat. That you can't necessarily get, like, because if you're doing something on a barbecue, especially on a cookie tray, every time you open that, you're losing heat in the barbecue. So you're losing that heat that the pizza would like initially. Whereas if you're sliding it into a pizza box, then it's got the enclosed heat. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah, 100%.
So that is wonderful. That little, and it was only $80 from Bunnings. So a baker's stone something, I can't remember, but it was it took a little bit of a learning curve, but it's definitely worthwhile. I'd like 2 of them, because making 8 pizzas, it would be really nice to have 2. But our barbecue's only a 4-burner, so it won't fit 2 on it.
Okay. Okay. So before we get into some questions, and I want to maybe talk about some troubleshooting of sourdough starter issues. I just want to tell anyone watching, if you've got a specific question, just drop it into the chat. Maybe put, like, hashtag question or question in bold, in all caps in front of it, so it jumps out at me when I'm like looking through. All right, so let's talk troubleshooting sourdough starter issues, because you mentioned before, say, when you are starting a starter, it's sometimes at day 4 will stall, and people think that is something that's gone wrong, but it hasn't gone wrong. What else might happen that might actually be something gone wrong? What have you dealt with? How have you resolved it?
Most of the time it's smell that people have issues with. They open it up and they get a smell a bit like that, what I said, the acetone, the nail polish remover smell. And generally speaking, that just means it's hungry. It just means that it's finished all its food and it's now eating itself, basically. So it can get smelly, and then my suggestion is just to feed it. Sometimes if it's left too long, it gets what's called a hooch, which is a gray liquid on the top, which again smells pretty bad. Some people will tip that hooch off and then feed it. I just stir it into my starter. It doesn't worry me, but it will look funny. Especially if you store it in the fridge and you've forgotten about it. So mine can be in the fridge for weeks at a time, like especially if I'm using 2 jars and I forget and I'm grabbing one jar out instead of the other. And then you find it in the back of the fridge and it's got the white starter on the bottom, and then it's got like 2 centimeters of gray murky looking liquid on the top, and most people would look at that and go, yeah, no, I've done something wrong. But it's what they call hooch. So it smells alcoholic, smells sort of vinegary, and you can pour it off and then feed it and it's perfectly fine, or you can stir it in and feed it. Generally speaking, a starter is recoverable so long as there is no orange or pink mold. So orange or pink colored mold is no, it's no good. Generally speaking, anything else is just part and parcel of the life cycle of the starter, depending on what you've done with it and what you haven't done with it. I have been known to get a big, like a disc of a skin on the top of it if I've forgotten it for a while, or if I've left it on my bench for a while. And so you've got like this solid disc on top of discolored starter. I just peel that off, take a bit from underneath and feed it. Like it doesn't, unless there's orange or pink colored mold, generally speaking, then it's recoverable, and you just need to feed it. You just need to make it happy again.
Do you, with the jars, do you, like, how often do you change jars? Do you clean jars? Like, how does that part work with the smooshy bits going up the side of the jar? That might go a bit gross.
Probably not as often as I should. So when it rises and falls, it leaves a residue on the side of the jar, and that residue on the side of the jar, the more often it does it, it ends up sort of caking on the side of the jar. Like it ends up like a like if you make a cake batter and the cake batter on the side of the bowl goes sort of hard and crunchy. You could probably do the right thing and swap jars. I tend to scrape it back into the starter because all it is dehydrated starter. realistically.
true. Yep.
Because it's just, so long as there's no discoloration, no mold or anything like that on it, it's basically just dehydrated starter. And if you add it back into the current liquid starter, it turns into liquid starter again.
Okay, that makes sense.
So I don't change my jars very often. Generally speaking, it has to be an incident that occurs it. So if it got tipped over and all the rim of the jar was covered in starter, then I'd probably change jars because it's too hard to clean the edge of the jar, and I use just scraps of fabric for the top. So if there's too much starter around the edge, the fabric will stick to it, and then you get fibers left behind from the fabric. So I try and keep the rim fairly clean. So if like the jar got tipped over, I'd probably start a new jar purely because it's easier than trying to clean that rim up on the jar. But other than that, I don't much.
Okay, cool.
Like I just keep using, I just scrape it down every time I use it and just keep on using it.
All right. We do have a question from Kerry Ann. Do you need to do anything different if you have to use gluten-free flour? Have you done gluten-free?
I haven't done gluten-free. Yeah, no, I haven't done gluten-free sourdough. I used to do gluten-free when the kids were younger because Cyril had issues with gluten, but I didn't do sourdough back then. From my understanding though, there is that you can basically do the same processes just with gluten-free flours. So a gluten-free flour blend is going to give you your most results that are going to be most like a standard white flour because they have already blend like, your Bob Red's Mill gluten-free flours and stuff. But I do know that some people use other flours as well for their gluten-free doughs and mix them themselves. But yeah, no, it's not something that I have done myself.
Do you make lasagna sheets out of when you do pasta, or is it always just spaghetti?
Or, lasagna sheets as well.
Sorry, noodles. Okay.
Yeah, no, we've done ravioli with it. So I did a kefir cheese I did a kefir cheese filled ravioli not that long ago, a couple of weeks ago or something, and did ravioli out of it, and the lasagna as well, and lasagna soup. So we do just cut it into
I remember seeing
chunks and put it in the lasagna soup. Yeah.
Awesome. There's quite a few people saying Fiona says, I'm currently doing my shaping of tin loaf whilst watching you guys. And Delvine says, watching this with my loaf proving next to me, enjoying the recipe ideas. So, she's off grid too, and she bakes her loaf in the Weber barbecue because she can't use the electric oven at night. And sometimes her loaf smells like sausages. Okay, so, we've got one more question from Bush Edge Homesteading, and then we'll probably be wrapping up soon. She asks, I see people putting their breads in preheated Dutch ovens and the like. Is the high temperature at the start critical?
I don't do a hot bake. I do a cold bake, but it depends on your desire for your end result, I suppose. The theory with putting it in the hot, and then quite often they put an ice cube or something in with the hot Dutch oven. So the idea is that because the Dutch oven's already hot, you put ice in it, it's creating steam, which theoretically gives you more lift in the dough, makes it go up quicker because the steam helps with that.
Yep.
I don't use cast iron Dutch ovens for a start because they're really heavy and awkward. So I have used them, and I just didn't find it was worth the extra time. You had to run the gas longer to preheat your Dutch oven and then put the bread in, and you're putting the bread into this awkward, heavy Dutch oven that's hot. Like the amount of times you burn yourself trying to get the dough in there. I think that I personally don't believe that it is enough of a benefit for the fiddling around with it. But again, it depends on what your desired end result is.
Yep, that's fair. All right, cool. Is there anything else that you think that we need to cover that I haven't asked about, or is that I think that's pretty comprehensive. Anything stand out as a... Okay.
I don't think so. I think that a lot of it is just a comfort level with doing it. I think the more you do it, the more you're going to understand, the more you're going to use it, and that to lose the fear factor of getting started, I suppose, because once you start it and you start observing what goes on, then you'll be able to do more. You'll be able to figure out what went wrong and why, and then learn from that, because everybody's house is different too, and everybody's rhythm is different, and the quantity of people that you're cooking for is different. So, you know, some people freeze half their loaves and some people eat them all in one sitting. And so you're going to want different results from that than the other person. Like, so you have to find what works for you in your situation. And the only way to do that is to do it over and over again.
Yeah. And like you said, get past that fear. It is a lot more forgiving and a lot more flexible than like a lot of the kind of sourdough geeks give it credit for.
And they're great. The all the fancy stuff is fantastic. And I have been known to try some of the fancy stuff, of course. But I think for every day, especially for families or especially homesteads where your days need to be flexible, you need your sourdough to be flexible as well. But we don't buy bread. So if we want bread, I have to be able to whip something up. And I have yeast on the shelf for using for different things. But the ability to just pull something out and make it work and not have to then go, oh, hang on, I might make dough, I might make bread tonight, so I got to feed my starter this morning in preparation for making it. And then if you don't make the bread, because there's plenty of times when you get to that point and you go, oh, I can't be bothered, or something happened, or whatever, and then you've spent all that time wasted during the day setting it up and then not used it, is not going to work for me anyway. And so I think that there's that ability to make it work for you rather than you working around it. You don't want to have a schedule that you have to work to. You want your bread to work around you, not you to work around it.
Perfect. That's great. I think that's a really great point to finish on. Nyssa, can you tell everybody where they can find you online?
Yeah, I'm on Our Small Footprint on YouTube and on Instagram and on Facebook. And I still haven't got my website going because I'm a bit slack. But eventually that will be up as well. But for the moment, YouTube is where I post most regularly. I tend to forget to post a lot of other places. So YouTube is where I am most commonly found.
Wonderful. And there's so many people in the comments saying, thank you so much. Great info and company. Thank you so much, Nyssa, for taking the time to share, especially with the newbies. Thank you so much. Thank you for the explanations. All right, everybody has loved this chat. So we'll take this opportunity to say goodbye to our viewers. Goodbye, everybody. And thanks again, Nyssa. That was just really wonderful. So we will head off now. See you guys.
Thank you.